Among the private papers donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1987, archivists discovered a leather-bound ledger that had been sealed for over a century. The document, written in meticulous handwriting, contained detailed records of human births, deaths, and what the author called genetic improvements across 17 plantations in the Charleston region during the 1840s. The ledger's 847 entries documented height measurements, physical descriptions, family lineages, and disturbing notations about breeding potential that read more like livestock records than human documentation. Most unsettling of all, the final pages contained correspondence between plantation owners discussing the successful implementation of selective breeding programs and profit margins that exceeded traditional cotton cultivation by 300%. What investigators found within those yellowed pages would reveal one of the most systematically cruel enterprises in American history, a network so carefully orchestrated that it operated for nearly 2 decades without detection. Before we continue with the story of what became known as the Charleston breeding conspiracy, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of dark history enthusiasts. The discovery of this ledger would ultimately expose a truth so disturbing that several prominent Charleston families successfully lobbied to keep the documents classified until the 21st century. Charleston in the 1840s stood as one of the wealthiest cities in the American South. Its prosperity built entirely upon the backs of enslaved labor and the fertile rice plantations that stretched along the Ashley and Cooper rivers. The city's elite families had grown incredibly sophisticated in their agricultural pursuits, applying scientific principles to crop rotation, soil management, and livestock breeding that made their operations among the most profitable in the nation. These same families, the Rabdennels, the Rutledges, the Pinckney, and the Drayton, gathered regularly at the Charleston Agricultural Society meetings, where they discussed not only cotton and rice yields but also what they euphemistically called labor optimization. Among this circle of plantation aristocracy moved a young man named Thomas Whitfield, whose family had recently acquired a modest rice plantation called Millbrook Estate, some 20 miles north of Charleston. Unlike his peers, Thomas harbored secret sympathies for the growing abolitionist movement, though he carefully concealed these beliefs behind a facade of Southern gentility. His father had sent him to study agriculture at Harvard, where he had been exposed to progressive ideas about human rights and dignity that directly contradicted everything he witnessed upon returning home to South Carolina. Thomas found himself in a unique position within Charleston's high society. His family's newly acquired wealth meant he was accepted into the inner circles of established plantation families. Yet his outsider status allowed him to observe their practices with fresh, increasingly horrified eyes. What he discovered during his first year back in Charleston would challenge everything he thought he knew about the depths of human cruelty. The summer social season of 1843 brought the usual round of garden parties and evening gatherings among Charleston's plantation elite. It was during one such evening at the Ravenel Mansion on East Bay Street that Thomas first overheard a conversation that would change his life forever. Dr. Edmund Ravenel, the family patriarch and a respected physician, was speaking in hushed tones with Colonel James Rutland about what they called the breeding initiative. The fragments Thomas caught were disturbing enough. References to genetic improvement, selective pairing, and enhanced productivity that he began paying closer attention to similar conversations at subsequent gatherings. As autumn arrived, Thomas noticed patterns in these discussions that made his blood run cold. The same families who prided themselves on their thoroughbred horses and prize-winning cattle were applying identical principles to the human beings they held in bondage. They spoke of bloodlines, of matching physical characteristics, of eliminating what they considered undesirable traits. Most chilling of all, they discussed these matters with the same clinical detachment they might use when planning the breeding of livestock. The true scope of what Thomas was uncovering became clear during a December evening at the Drayton estate, where he witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Drayton plantation's main house glowed with warm lamplight against the cold December evening, as Charleston's most influential families gathered for their annual harvest celebration. Thomas arrived fashionably late, as was expected of young men of his social standing, carrying with him a small leather journal he had begun using to document the disturbing conversations he continued to overhear. What he witnessed that night, however, went far beyond mere conversation. As the evening progressed, and the older men retreated to Colonel Drayton's study for brandy and cigars, Thomas excused himself under the pretense of needing fresh air. Instead, he positioned himself near the study's exterior window, where the December chill kept other guests away from the garden paths. The voices from within carried clearly through the partially opened window, and what Thomas heard made his hands shake as he struggled to write in the darkness. Dr. Shate, Ravenel was reading from what sounded like a formal report, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard without interruption. The results from our 3-year initiative have exceeded all projections, he announced. Millfield Plantation has produced 17 births from our selected pairings, with an average height increase of 2 in over the previous generation. More importantly, the children show enhanced physical capacity and resistance to common ailments. Colonel Rutblood's voice joined in, and Thomas could hear papers rustling. The Pinckney operations had been equally successful. Their focus on selecting for docility while maintaining physical strength has produced remarkable results. The new generation shows 25% less resistance to instruction while maintaining superior work capacity. But it was the third voice that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. Colonel Drayton himself was speaking, and his words revealed the true scope of their operations. Gentlemen, what we have accomplished here extends far beyond individual plantation success. Our network now includes operations in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The breeding records we maintain allow us to track bloodlines across state boundaries, ensuring optimal genetic combinations that would have been impossible working in isolation. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor was followed by footsteps, and Thomas pressed himself against the cold brick wall as Colonel Drayton continued. I have here the quarterly reports from our partner plantations. The Bennings operation in Georgia has successfully produced 43 births using our selective breeding protocols. The children are being evaluated for distribution to our network members based on their projected capabilities. Thomas felt sick as the implications became clear. These men weren't just treating human beings like livestock. They were operating a coordinated network that spanned multiple states, systematically breeding people for specific traits and distributing the children like commodities. Dr. Ravenel's voice returned, now discussing what he called the documentation protocols. Each birth must be recorded with precise measurements, parentage information, and projected value assessments. Our records now contain detailed information on over 800 individuals across the network. This data allows us to plan breeding combinations 5 years in advance. The conversation continued for another hour, during which Thomas learned details that would later fill dozens of pages in his journal. They discussed breeding houses where young women were kept specifically for reproduction, stud selections, where men were chosen for their physical attributes, and crop assessments where children were evaluated like agricultural products. Most horrifying of all, they spoke of children who didn't meet their standards being redirected to standard agricultural operations. A euphemism Thomas understood meant separation from families and sale to plantations where life expectancy was significantly lower. As the evening concluded and the men began to disperse, Thomas remained hidden in the garden until he was certain all had departed. The documents and conversations he had witnessed that night revealed something far more systematic and widespread than anything he had imagined. This wasn't the cruel whim of individual plantation owners. It was an organized enterprise with record-keeping, profit projections, and multi-state coordination that operated with the efficiency of any successful business venture. Walking back to his own plantation that night, Thomas made a decision that would determine the course of his life. He would find a way to infiltrate this network, document its operations, and expose the truth to the world. What he didn't realize was that his investigation would ultimately uncover evidence of practices so systematically cruel that even seasoned abolitionists would struggle to believe his accounts. The breeding network that Thomas had stumbled upon represented something unprecedented in the history of American slavery, a coordinated attempt to apply scientific principles to human reproduction on an industrial scale, operated by some of the most respected families in Southern society. The weeks following the December gathering transformed Thomas from a passive observer into an active infiltrator, though he quickly learned that gaining access to the network's inner workings would require more than social connections. The breeding consortium, as he came to think of it, operated with layers of secrecy that protected its most damaging activities from casual discovery. Members communicated through coded correspondence, held private meetings at rotating locations, and maintained their most detailed records in secure locations away from their primary residences. Thomas's first breakthrough came through his friendship with William Pinckney, the youngest son of one of the network's founding families. William, barely 22 and eager to prove himself worthy of his family's trust, had recently been granted access to what his father called the advanced agricultural operations. Unlike the older generation, who spoke in careful euphemisms, William's youth made him more careless with details, especially when he had been drinking. During a January evening of cards and whiskey at the Charleston Club, William boasted about his family's revolutionary approaches to labor management and mentioned something that made Thomas's pulse quicken. The Pinckney Plantation maintained what William called breeding quarters, specialized housing designed specifically for their selective breeding program. More importantly, William mentioned that his father had granted him access to the master registry, a comprehensive ledger that tracked bloodlines, breeding histories, and what he called genetic improvements across the entire network. Thomas realized that gaining access to this master registry would provide the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the network's operations. However, infiltrating the Pinckney Plantation would require careful planning and considerable risk. The breeding quarters were located in a remote section of the plantation, heavily supervised and strictly off-limits to outsiders. The master registry itself was kept in a locked safe within the plantation's main office, accessible only to senior family members. Over the following months, Thomas developed a careful strategy. He began courting William's sister, Margaret Pinckney, using their romantic relationship as cover for frequent visits to the plantation. Margaret, an intelligent and spirited woman who shared some of Thomas's progressive views about education and social reform, unknowingly became his entry point into the family's private operations. Their relationship, which began as calculated deception on Thomas's part, gradually evolved into genuine affection, adding another layer of moral complexity to his mission. Through Margaret, Thomas gained invitations to family dinners, social gatherings, and eventually overnight stays at the plantation. Each visit allowed him to gather intelligence about the facility's layout, security procedures, and operational schedules. He learned that the breeding quarters housed approximately 40 women between the ages of 16 and 30, all selected for what the family called optimal reproductive characteristics. These women were kept in conditions that were physically comfortable by the standards of slavery: better food, cleaner housing, medical attention, but were subject to reproductive control that was absolute and systematic. The men selected for the breeding program were rotated between plantations within the network, their movements carefully tracked to ensure genetic diversity while maintaining desired traits. Thomas discovered that the network maintained detailed health records, family histories, and even personality assessments for each individual in their breeding program. Children born into the program were evaluated at birth, with those meeting specific criteria being raised in specialized nurseries, while others were separated from their mothers and distributed to other plantations. By the spring of 1844, Thomas had gathered enough intelligence to attempt his most ambitious infiltration yet. Margaret had mentioned that her father would be traveling to Georgia for a regional network meeting, leaving the plantation under the supervision of the overseer. This absence would provide Thomas with his best opportunity to access the master registry and the breeding quarters themselves. What Thomas discovered during that May evening would reveal the true scope of the network's operations and provide him with evidence of systematic human rights violations that extended far beyond anything he had previously imagined. The master registry contained not just records of the Charleston area operations, but detailed correspondence with similar networks in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and even as far west as Mississippi. The breeding program wasn't limited to a small group of South Carolina plantations. It was a coordinated enterprise that spanned the entire South. But the most disturbing discovery awaited Thomas in the breeding quarters themselves, where he would finally witness firsthand the human cost of the network's scientific approach to human reproduction. Thomas's opportunity came on a humid May evening when a spring thunderstorm provided the perfect cover for his infiltration of the Pinckney Plantation's most secretive operations. Margaret had retired early with a headache, and her father's absence meant the main house was lightly staffed. Using his knowledge of the plantation's layout, Thomas made his way through the formal gardens toward the cluster of buildings that housed what the family euphemistically called their specialized agricultural facilities. The breeding quarters occupied a compound of 6 buildings constructed in a square formation around a central courtyard. Unlike the cramped slave cabins found on most plantations, these structures were built with careful attention to ventilation, space, and even modest comfort. Thomas realized immediately that the improved conditions served a calculated purpose. Healthy, well-fed women were more likely to produce the healthy children that made the program profitable. Moving carefully through the shadows, Thomas approached the main dormitory building. Through the partially open shutters, he could see rows of beds arranged with military precision, each occupied by a young woman. What struck him most was the silence. No conversation, no movement, just the sound of quiet breathing from women who appeared to be sleeping despite the early evening hour. Only later would Thomas learn that the women were given mild sedatives each evening to ensure compliance and prevent communication that might lead to resistance or escape planning. The second building contained what appeared to be medical facilities with examination tables, scales, and measuring devices that Thomas recognized from veterinary practices. Detailed charts hung on the walls tracking monthly cycles, nutritional intake, and what were clearly pregnancy schedules. The clinical precision of these records made Thomas's stomach turn as he realized that every aspect of these women's reproductive lives was monitored, recorded, and controlled with scientific methodology. But it was in the third building that Thomas discovered the most disturbing evidence of the program's systematic approach to human breeding. This structure served as both a nursery and evaluation center, where newborn children were assessed for their genetic potential before being assigned to different tracks within the network. Charts on the walls categorized children by physical measurements, behavioral assessments, and projected economic value. Those deemed premium stock were marked for special care and education, while others were designated for standard agricultural deployment. The master registry, which Thomas finally accessed in the plantation's main office, contained evidence that the network's operations were far more extensive and sophisticated than anything he had previously imagined. The ledger documented 1,047 individuals across 17 plantations, with detailed family trees tracking genetic lineages back 3 generations. Breeding schedules were planned years in advance with specific pairings designed to enhance particular traits while eliminating others considered undesirable. Most shocking of all were the correspondence files, which revealed that the network maintained active communication with similar operations in other states. Letters from Georgia discussed successful breeding outcomes and offered to share genetic stock for mutual benefit. Correspondence from Virginia described new techniques for evaluating breeding potential and proposed joint ventures for expanding operations. A letter from a plantation in Mississippi included detailed financial projections showing that specialized breeding operations generated profits 3 times higher than traditional cotton cultivation. As Thomas copied page after page of evidence by candlelight, he began to understand that he had uncovered something unprecedented in American history. This wasn't simply the cruel exploitation of enslaved people. It was the systematic application of scientific principles to human reproduction on an industrial scale, operated by respected members of Southern society who viewed their activities as agricultural innovation rather than human rights violations. The network's success had emboldened its members to expand their operations and refine their techniques. New correspondence discussed plans for establishing breeding facilities in Texas and Arkansas, territories where land was cheaper and oversight was minimal. Other letters described experiments in education and training, attempting to produce not just physically capable workers, but individuals with specialized skills that could command premium prices in urban markets. Thomas spent 4 hours in the office working by the dim light of a single candle as the thunderstorm raged outside. By dawn, he had documented enough evidence to expose the network's operations to authorities. But he also realized that the network's members included some of the most powerful men in South Carolina. Judges, politicians, and respected community leaders were all implicated in the correspondence he had discovered. Exposing them would require more than evidence. It would require a strategy that could overcome their influence and social connections. As Thomas made his way back through the plantation's grounds in the pre-dawn darkness, he was already planning his next moves. The evidence he had gathered was damning, but he knew that the network's members would go to extreme lengths to protect their operations and their reputations. What he didn't realize was that his infiltration had already been discovered, and that the network was about to demonstrate just how far they were willing to go to preserve their secrets. The young woman who had been watching from the shadows of the main house would soon report Thomas's nighttime activities to her masters, setting in motion a chain of events that would test not only Thomas's commitment to justice, but his very survival. The morning after Thomas's infiltration brought an unexpected visitor to Millbrook Estate. Colonel Drayton arrived unannounced, accompanied by 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. One introduced as Dr. No, Samuel Huger, described as a specialist in plantation security, and the other simply as Mr. Crawford, whose cold eyes and scarred hands suggested a background in activities far removed from agriculture. Their presence at Thomas's breakfast table created an atmosphere of barely concealed menace that made every word feel dangerous. Colonel Drayton's opening pleasantries carried subtle threats wrapped in Southern courtesy. "Thomas, my boy, we'd become concerned about some irregularities in our agricultural operations. It seems someone has been taking an unusual interest in our private business methods." His smile never wavered, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas with predatory intensity. Dr. Huger here specializes in identifying and resolving security breaches that might threaten our agricultural innovations. Thomas forced himself to maintain composure while his mind raced through possible responses. His training at Harvard had included debate and rhetoric, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, where a single wrong word could expose him as a threat to men who had demonstrated their willingness to treat human beings as property. He opted for confused innocence, expressing puzzlement about any security concerns while subtly probing for information about what they might know. Dr. Trace. Huger leaned forward, his voice carrying clinical precision that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of how the network discussed their breeding operations. Mr. Time, Whitfield, we have reason to believe that someone with access to our social gatherings has been documenting private conversations and possibly accessing confidential records. Such activities represent not just a breach of social etiquette, but a direct threat to legitimate business operations. The barely veiled accusation hung in the air like smoke from a pistol. Thomas realized that his relationship with Margaret Pinckney had provided him with access, but it had also made him visible to people whose survival depended on maintaining absolute secrecy. Crawford, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, was studying Thomas with the focus of a man evaluating potential violence. His presence wasn't accidental. He was there to handle whatever resolution Dr. Huger and Colonel Drayton deemed necessary. Thomas made a calculated decision to shift the dynamic by expressing his own concerns about suspicious activities he claimed to have noticed. Gentlemen, I'm actually relieved you've come to me with these concerns. I've been troubled by some conversations I've overheard at social gatherings. Talk about agricultural operations that seemed unusual. I've wondered if someone might be using our social connections to gather intelligence for competitors or even federal agents. This response caught his visitors off guard, forcing them to consider whether Thomas was a threat to be eliminated or a potential ally to be recruited. Colonel Drayton exchanged glances with Dr. Tom Huger before responding. What specifically has troubled you about these conversations, Thomas? Thomas walked a careful line, demonstrating knowledge that proved he had been listening while presenting himself as someone concerned about protecting the network rather than exposing it. He mentioned hearing discussions about breeding protocols and genetic improvements that made him wonder if other plantation owners were attempting to steal their innovations. This approach allowed him to reveal his knowledge while positioning himself as protective rather than threatening. Dr. Servey, Huga's response revealed the depth of the network's paranoia and the lengths they were willing to go to protect their operations. Thomas, what you described suggests you understand the revolutionary nature of our agricultural innovations. These methods represent years of scientific development and substantial financial investment. More importantly, they represent approaches to labor management that certain political elements would deliberately mischaracterize if they became public knowledge. The conversation continued for 2 hours, during which Thomas learned that the network had already identified him as a potential security risk. Margaret Pinckney's housemaid, a woman named Sarah, who had been born into the breeding program, had observed Thomas's nighttime movements and reported them to her masters. The network had been watching Thomas for weeks, evaluating whether he represented a threat to be eliminated or an asset to be recruited. Crawford finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to violence. Mr. Whitfield, we verified that you accessed the Pinckney estate's private records 2 nights ago. We have a witness who observed you copying documents from the master registry. You now possess information that could destroy legitimate business operations and ruin respectable families. Thomas felt his carefully constructed facade crumbling as Crawford continued. However, Dr. Huger believes you might be valuable to our operations rather than threatening to them. Your Harvard education and your family's recent acquisition of plantation property make you potentially useful for expanding our network's capabilities. What followed was a proposal that revealed the network's ambitious plans for growth and Thomas's impossible position. They offered him a choice: join their operations as a full member, contributing his plantation to their breeding network and his education to their scientific methodology, or face the consequences of threatening their security. The consequences weren't explicitly stated, but Crawford's presence made the implications clear. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Thomas requested time to consider their proposal, knowing that his answer would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of hundreds of enslaved people trapped within the network's systematic breeding program. As his visitors departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of barely contained threat, Thomas realized that his investigation had reached a critical juncture. He now possessed enough evidence to expose the network, but doing so would require him to escape from men who had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their operations. The next phase of Thomas's mission would test not only his courage, but his ability to outmaneuver opponents who controlled local law enforcement, held significant political influence, and had already proven their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. The young abolitionists, who had seemed so confident in their Boston meetings, had never imagined the sophisticated and dangerous nature of the system they sought to destroy. Thomas's response to the network's ultimatum came 3 days later, delivered in the form of what appeared to be enthusiastic acceptance of their invitation to join their operations. He arrived at the designated meeting location, a private room above Henderson's Tavern in downtown Charleston, carrying a leather portfolio that he claimed contained detailed plans for converting Millbrook Estate into a specialized breeding facility. What the portfolio actually contained would soon transform a gathering of confident conspirators into a desperate struggle for survival and expose the true reach of their operations across the American South. The room above Henderson's Tavern had been chosen for its privacy and multiple exits, standard precautions for men conducting business they couldn't afford to have heard. The establishment itself was owned by Marcus Henderson, a free black man whose position in Charleston society required careful navigation between the competing interests of white patrons and the enslaved community who sometimes sought his discreet assistance. Unknown to the network members, Henderson had already agreed to help Thomas document their meeting through a series of strategically placed listening devices that would capture their conversations for posterity. Colonel Drayton, Dr. Huger, Crawford, and 7 other network members had assembled to formally induct Thomas into their organization and receive his plantation's contribution to their expanding operations. The gathering represented the largest assembly of network leadership that had occurred in over 2 years, brought together by the significance of adding a Harvard-educated member to their ranks and the potential for expanding operations into new territories. The atmosphere was celebratory, with expensive French brandy and congratulations on Thomas's wise decision to join the future of Southern agriculture. Dr. Huger had prepared a formal presentation about the network's scientific achievements, complete with charts and graphs that demonstrated the measurable improvements they had achieved through selective breeding programs. The presentation revealed details about their operations that even Thomas hadn't suspected, including partnerships with medical colleges that provided scientific consultation on genetics and reproduction. Thomas learned that the network's influence extended into academic institutions throughout the South, where professors of natural philosophy and medicine provided theoretical support for their breeding programs. Letters of collaboration from respected scientists at the University of Georgia, the College of Charleston, and even Harvard Medical School demonstrated that the network's operations had intellectual legitimacy within the scientific community of the time. These academic partnerships provided both scientific credibility and political protection that made their activities seem like legitimate agricultural research rather than systematic human rights violations. The network's financial success had enabled them to fund research into what Dr. Huger called advanced breeding methodologies that went far beyond simple selective pairing. They had developed detailed psychological assessment techniques for evaluating personality traits, educational programs designed to enhance the value of their products, and even experimental medical procedures intended to improve fertility rates and reduce infant mortality. The scope of their scientific ambitions revealed a level of systematic dehumanization that shocked even Thomas, who thought he had understood the full extent of their cruelty. Thomas played his role perfectly for nearly 2 hours, expressing enthusiasm for the network's scientific approaches and gratitude for being trusted with their revolutionary methods. He presented detailed architectural drawings for converting his slave quarters into breeding facilities, complete with medical examination rooms, specialized nursery facilities, and what he called genetic documentation centers that impressed even Dr. Huger with their attention to systematic efficiency. The plans were so convincing that several network members asked for copies to implement at their own operations. During his presentation, Thomas revealed that he had been corresponding with plantation owners in Texas and Arkansas who were interested in establishing network operations in territories where land was cheaper and federal oversight was minimal. This information excited the network members who saw opportunities for massive expansion that could multiply their profits while reducing the risks associated with operating in established states, where abolitionist sentiment was growing stronger. The transformation began when Thomas opened a second section of his portfolio, explaining that he had brought documentation to demonstrate his commitment to their shared vision. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I believe you'll find these records demonstrate not only my understanding of your methods, but my ability to improve upon them through systematic documentation and analysis that surpasses even your current sophisticated approaches." What Thomas revealed were not plans for joining their network, but meticulously copied records from their own master registry, correspondence files, breeding schedules, and financial projections. Page after page of evidence that documented every aspect of their operations, from individual breeding assignments to profit projections, from multi-state coordination to plans for territorial expansion, medical records, genetic charts, and personal correspondence that revealed the intimate details of their systematic approach to human breeding. The documents included evidence that Thomas had gathered over months of investigation, but also new revelations that he had discovered during his 3 days of preparation for this confrontation. Using his access to Margaret Pinckney's trust, he had obtained letters from network operations in Virginia that described successful breeding programs involving over 300 enslaved individuals. Correspondence from Georgia revealed partnerships with slave traders who specialized in locating individuals with specific physical characteristics for breeding purposes. Most damaging of all were financial records that showed the network had generated profits exceeding $800,000 over the previous 5 years. Money that had been used to purchase political influence and fund expansion into new territories. The men around the table realized simultaneously that Thomas hadn't come to join them. He had come to destroy them with evidence so comprehensive that denial would be impossible. The silence in the room lasted only seconds before Crawford moved, reaching for the pistol he carried beneath his coat. Thomas was prepared for violence, but the sophisticated nature of his planning went beyond simple physical preparation. His months of investigation had included not just document gathering, but careful coordination with networks of abolitionists and freed blacks who were positioned throughout Charleston to respond to predetermined signals. The weighted walking stick that Thomas carried as a fashionable accessory became a weapon that caught Crawford across the wrist with enough force to send his pistol spinning across the room. But that was only the beginning of Thomas's defensive strategy. The sound of breaking glass from the tavern's first floor indicated that Marcus Henderson had activated the emergency plan they had developed, signaling allies positioned throughout the building and surrounding area. What followed was chaos that spilled beyond the private room into the tavern below and out into Charleston streets. Dr. Turr. Huga lunged for the documents scattered across the table while Colonel Drayton shouted orders to block the exits. But they quickly discovered that their meeting had been anticipated and surrounded. The network members found themselves trapped in a room that had become a carefully constructed cage, with escape routes monitored and evidence of their activities being copied by multiple witnesses. Thomas fought his way toward the window overlooking the alley behind the tavern, clutching the most damaging evidence against his chest, while using his walking stick to keep his attackers at bay. Behind him, the network members were shouting conflicting orders, some demanding pursuit, while others insisted on recovering and destroying the evidence before it could be made public. The sophisticated coordination they had used to operate their breeding network now worked against them as they struggled to respond to an unexpected threat. The window shattered as Thomas threw himself through it, landing hard in the alley, but maintaining his grip on the documents that represented months of dangerous investigation. However, his escape was part of a larger plan that involved creating multiple copies of evidence and distributing them to trusted allies before the network could organize an effective response. Even if Thomas were captured or killed, the evidence would survive to expose their operations. Behind him, the network members were discovering that their emergency contingency plans were insufficient for the situation they now faced. Men who had appeared from side streets and building entrances, who they had assumed were working to prevent Thomas from escaping, were actually abolitionists and freed blacks who had been positioned to protect Thomas and ensure that evidence of the network's operations reached safety. The chase through Charleston's waterfront district demonstrated both the network's reach and resources and the effectiveness of the counter-network that Thomas had assembled over months of careful planning. What appeared to be a desperate escape was actually a carefully orchestrated operation designed to expose the breeding network while protecting the evidence and witnesses needed to ensure their prosecution. Thomas reached the Cooper River docks not as a fugitive seeking escape, but as a central figure in a confrontation that had been planned to force the network's operations into public view. The boat waiting at the dock contained not just supplies for escape, but printing equipment and additional copies of evidence that would be distributed throughout Charleston before the network could organize an effective response to suppress the revelations. Marcus, the freed black sailor who Thomas had claimed was unconscious from attack, was actually coordinating the distribution of evidence to multiple locations throughout the city. The apparent attack had been staged to make the network members believe they had successfully disrupted Thomas's escape plan, when in reality they had walked into a trap that would expose their operations to public scrutiny. Standing on the dock with evidence that could destroy some of Charleston's most powerful families, Thomas faced the moment he had been preparing for since his first discovery of the network's operations. The confrontation would determine not only his survival, but the fate of hundreds of enslaved people trapped within the breeding network and the future of similar operations throughout the South. Crawford emerged from the shadows with his pistol drawn, flanked by 8 other men whose faces Thomas recognized from Charleston's social gatherings. These weren't hired thugs, but respected members of society who had chosen to protect their interests through violence, revealing the depths of corruption that enabled the network's operations. "Mr. Bargett," Whitfield, Crawford announced, his voice carrying deadly authority. "You've created a situation that requires immediate and permanent resolution. Those documents must be destroyed, and your knowledge of our operations must be permanently contained." Thomas's response revealed the true scope of his planning and the impossible position the network now faced. Rather than responding with fear or defiance, he smiled and gestured toward the surrounding area where dozens of witnesses had gathered to observe the confrontation. "Gentlemen," Thomas announced, his voice carrying clearly across the harbor, "I believe you'll find that containing this situation is no longer possible. The evidence you're so concerned about has already been distributed to journalists, federal investigators, and abolitionist networks in 6 different cities. The revelation that their meeting had been not just observed but recorded, and that evidence of their operations was already beyond their ability to suppress, transformed the network members from hunters into hunted. The systematic approach they had used to operate their breeding programs now worked against them as their carefully maintained secrecy was stripped away by equally systematic exposure. What happened next on that Charleston dock would later be disputed by surviving witnesses, but the consequences reverberated through Southern society in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Thomas, faced with armed men who represented some of Charleston's most powerful families, made a decision that transformed a local confrontation into a national scandal that reached the halls of Congress and influenced the growing debate over slavery's future in America. Rather than surrender the documents or attempt to fight impossible odds, Thomas did something that caught his pursuers completely off guard and demonstrated the sophisticated nature of his planning. He began reading aloud from the network's own records, his voice carrying across the harbor as he recited names, dates, and specific details of breeding operations that implicated not just the men facing him, but dozens of respected families throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. The public recitation was not a desperate act, but a carefully planned element of Thomas's strategy to ensure that evidence of the network's operations could not be suppressed through violence or intimidation. As his voice carried across the docks, dock workers, sailors, late-evening travelers, and residents of nearby buildings began to gather, drawn by the shocking nature of what they were hearing. Each word Thomas spoke created additional witnesses to information that the network had killed to protect. Crawford and his associates found themselves facing a crowd of witnesses to information they had committed multiple murders to conceal. Thomas continued reading, his voice growing stronger as more people gathered to hear evidence of practices that most had never imagined possible. The network members realized that silencing Thomas now would only confirm the truth of what he was revealing to dozens of witnesses, while failing to act would allow him to continue exposing their operations to an ever-growing audience. The documents Thomas read from included not just the breeding records he had originally discovered, but additional evidence that revealed the network's connections to slave traders, medical professionals, academic institutions, and political figures throughout the South. Names of prominent Charleston families were linked to specific breeding operations, financial transactions, and correspondence that demonstrated their direct involvement in systematic human trafficking and forced reproduction. As Thomas continued his public exposure, the gathering crowd began to include individuals whose own families had been affected by the network's operations, freed blacks who had been born into breeding programs, former slaves who had witnessed the separation of families for breeding purposes, and white citizens who had unknowingly conducted business with network operations, found themselves hearing documented evidence of activities that explained mysteries and tragedies from their own experiences. The confrontation ended not with violence, but with the arrival of Charleston city constables, drawn by reports of a disturbance at the docks and the growing crowd that had assembled to hear Thomas's revelations. However, the constables found themselves in an impossible position, as Thomas's public recitation had created dozens of witnesses to evidence that implicated some of their own political and social superiors. The complexity of Charleston's social hierarchies created a moment of legal and social paralysis that allowed Thomas to complete his exposure of the network's operations. When the constables finally intervened, Thomas voluntarily surrendered himself and the documents to their custody. Knowing that the public nature of his revelations had made it impossible for the network to suppress the evidence through normal channels of influence and intimidation, the constables found themselves holding evidence of systematic crimes that implicated some of the most powerful men in South Carolina, creating a legal and political crisis that extended far beyond their ability to resolve through normal procedures. Dr. Huger attempted to discredit Thomas's revelations by claiming the documents were forgeries created by radical abolitionists to damage innocent plantation families. But the detailed nature of the records, including information that could only have come from inside the network, made such denials increasingly difficult to sustain. Several witnesses in the crowd recognized names and dates that corresponded to events they had personally observed or experienced, providing independent confirmation of the document's authenticity. The immediate aftermath of Thomas's exposure created chaos within Charleston's social elite that extended far beyond the breeding network itself. Families scrambled to distance themselves from documented activities while simultaneously attempting to discredit or suppress evidence that threatened not just individual reputations, but the entire social structure that supported their way of life. The systematic nature of the evidence Thomas had gathered made selective denial impossible, forcing the network's members to choose between comprehensive cover-up attempts and complete abandonment of their operations. Within hours of the confrontation, copies of the network's documents had been distributed to newspaper offices in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and Philadelphia. The evidence reached abolitionist networks that had been seeking exactly this type of documented proof of systematic breeding operations, providing them with material that would fuel anti-slavery arguments for years to come. Federal investigators who had been examining violations of interstate commerce laws related to slave trading found themselves with evidence of coordinated criminal activities that crossed state boundaries and involved respected political figures. Thomas himself disappeared from Charleston within days of the confrontation, but his departure was part of a carefully planned extraction that had been coordinated with abolitionist networks before his final confrontation with the breeding consortium. Rather than fleeing in panic, Thomas was relocated to safe houses in Philadelphia, where he spent months working with journalists and investigators to verify and expand upon the evidence he had gathered. His detailed knowledge of the network's operations provided the foundation for investigations that ultimately exposed similar breeding operations throughout the South. The network's response to exposure revealed both the extent of their influence and the limitations of their power when confronted with systematic evidence gathering and public exposure. Several key witnesses, including dock workers who had heard Thomas's revelations, received offers of substantial bribes to recount their testimony or deny what they had witnessed. When bribery failed, some witnesses suffered mysterious accidents or disappeared entirely, demonstrating the network's willingness to use violence to protect their interests even after their operations had been exposed. However, the network's attempts to suppress evidence through intimidation and violence only confirmed the truth of Thomas's revelations and provided additional evidence of their criminal activities. Federal investigators began treating witness intimidation as evidence of guilt rather than innocence, leading to expanded investigations that uncovered financial records, correspondence, and physical evidence that had been overlooked during the initial exposure. The network's attempts to cover up their activities created a trail of additional crimes that made prosecution easier rather than more difficult. Records at participating plantations were hastily destroyed in the weeks following Thomas's exposure, but the systematic nature of the network's operations meant the complete destruction of evidence was impossible. Breeding records, financial transactions, correspondence, and physical modifications to plantation facilities had created a documentary trail that extended across multiple states and involved hundreds of individuals. Even partial destruction of records left enough evidence to reconstruct the network's operations and identify additional participants who had not been named in Thomas's original revelations. Key network members temporarily relocated to properties in other states or territories where their reputations remained intact, but their flight from South Carolina was interpreted by investigators and the public as admission of guilt rather than innocent relocation. The abandonment of their Charleston properties and social positions provided additional evidence of their involvement in criminal activities, while their attempts to establish new identities in other locations led to investigations that exposed similar breeding operations in Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. The financial impact of exposure proved devastating to the network's operations, even where legal prosecution was difficult due to political connections and the complexities of slavery law. The systematic breeding programs that had generated enormous profits required absolute secrecy to maintain premium pricing for their products, and public exposure destroyed the market for slaves bred through systematic programs. Plantation owners who had invested heavily in breeding facilities and specialized staff found their investments worthless when buyers refused to purchase slaves associated with exposed breeding operations. Margaret Pinckney, who had unknowingly provided Thomas with access to her family's operations, suffered a complete nervous collapse upon learning the true purpose of his courtship and the extent of her family's involvement in systematic human breeding. Her personal tragedy reflected the broader social upheaval created by revelations that forced Charleston society to confront the systematic cruelty that had operated within their respected social circles. Some families destroyed by the scandal relocated to territories where their reputations remained intact, while others attempted to rebuild their social standing through philanthropic activities designed to demonstrate reformed attitudes toward human rights. The Pinckney family's attempts to distance themselves from their documented involvement in breeding operations led to internal conflicts that ultimately destroyed both their financial position and their social standing. Margaret's younger brother, William, whose careless revelations had provided Thomas with initial intelligence about the network, challenged his father's attempts to deny their family's involvement and provided additional evidence to investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The family's public disputes over responsibility and knowledge created additional evidence of their involvement while destroying any possibility of maintaining unified denial. Dr. Farby E. Mew, Huger's attempts to maintain his medical practice and scientific reputation failed as evidence of his involvement in human breeding experiments became public knowledge. His correspondence with medical colleges that had provided scientific consultation for breeding programs implicated academic institutions throughout the South, leading to investigations that exposed the intellectual foundations of systematic human breeding and the extent to which respected scientific institutions had provided legitimacy for criminal activities. The Charleston Breeding Network ultimately disbanded, not through legal prosecution, but through the impossibility of maintaining operations that required absolute secrecy once their methods had become public knowledge. The financial losses from abandoned operations and relocated assets bankrupted several participating families, while others found their social and political influence permanently damaged by association with documented human rights violations. The network's sophisticated coordination, which had been their greatest strength during years of successful operation, became their greatest vulnerability once exposed to public scrutiny. Federal investigations ultimately led to prosecutions under interstate commerce laws rather than direct challenges to slavery itself, as the network's operations had violated existing laws governing the transportation and sale of slaves across state boundaries. Several network members were convicted of conspiracy and fraud charges related to false documentation of slave origins and breeding histories, while others faced financial penalties that destroyed their economic positions, even without criminal convictions. Thomas Whitfield's fate remained unknown for decades until family papers donated to Harvard University in the 1920s revealed that he had survived his escape from Charleston and spent the remainder of his life working with underground networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. His documentation of the breeding network's operations became some of the most damaging evidence presented to Congress during debates over slavery that preceded the Civil War, providing concrete examples of systematic abuses that challenged the paternalistic justifications used to defend slavery as a benevolent institution. The master registry that Thomas had copied disappeared from public record after the initial investigations, leading some historians to speculate that powerful interests succeeded in suppressing evidence of practices too systematic and widespread to acknowledge without threatening the entire social structure of the antebellum South. However, recent discoveries in private family papers and estate records have revealed that breeding networks similar to those documented in Charleston operated throughout the South, most more successful than the Charleston operation in maintaining secrecy and destroying evidence of their activities. Modern historians estimate that systematic breeding operations may have affected tens of thousands of enslaved individuals throughout the antebellum South, representing a form of systematic dehumanization that went beyond the already horrific conditions of slavery to treat human reproduction as an industrial process subject to scientific management and profit optimization. The Charleston Network's exposure provided a glimpse into practices that were likely far more widespread than historical records indicate, as most similar operations successfully destroyed evidence of their activities. The long-term impact of Thomas's exposure extended beyond the immediate destruction of the Charleston Network to influence broader debates about slavery and human rights that ultimately contributed to the political tensions leading to the Civil War. Evidence of systematic breeding operations provided abolitionists with concrete examples of slavery's dehumanizing effects that could not be dismissed as exaggerated propaganda, while Southern defenders of slavery found themselves unable to justify practices that treated human reproduction as agricultural science. This mystery shows us how systems of oppression can operate with scientific precision and social respectability when those in power choose to treat human beings as economic resources rather than people deserving of dignity and rights. The Charleston breeding network represented not just individual cruelty, but institutional evil that required coordination, planning, and intellectual justification to function effectively. The network's sophisticated operations demonstrate how systematic dehumanization can be normalized through scientific language and social acceptance, while Thomas's exposure reveals the power of individual courage and systematic documentation to challenge even the most entrenched systems of abuse. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in Charleston's history? The evidence suggests that the Charleston network was only one example of systematic breeding operations that may have been far more widespread than historical records indicate. Leave your comment below with your thoughts about how systematic abuse can be hidden within respected social institutions. If you enjoy this tale and want more dark historical mysteries that expose hidden truths from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering the disturbing realities that shaped our history. See you in the next video.